You've characterized the ANC January 8 statement as a bash, and it seems as though you don't believe that the President and the ANC realize the gravity of the situation that South Africa finds itself in. Is that a correct assessment?
Well, I think that, to be fair, the President does recognize that we are in serious trouble, and he has said it on many occasions. I do think, however, that he has to now start being honest with South Africans, that getting out of this mess is going to require some hard trade-offs. It's going to require standing up to some of the people within his party and to standing up to some of the people within the private sector itself. And he's going to have to say, I mean, much of the views of the radical economic transformation camp is utter nonsensical stuff. It's completely out of touch with the modern economy, and frankly will plunder South Africa into a crisis. But at the same time, the views coming out of the Institute for Race Relations, which only focuses on growth and doesn't worry about inequality, is as dangerous because it's completely dislocated from our context. What we need is a mix of both growth, but we also need some inclusion. We have to take seriously how we spend that growth and make sure that we're investing in the economy, in education, in healthcare, so that everybody benefits from society's wealth.
So I take it that you're not impressed with Tito Mboweni's paper on economic transformation, inclusive growth and competitiveness, and the current economic policies that are in South Africa now to address some of the challenges.
So some of what the Tito's paper actually focuses on is already captured in some of the tweets that I speak about. So I think that they're absolutely right about we've got to be clear on state-owned enterprises, and we've got to be very clear about which are necessary to have in public hands and which are not. Tito is very, very clear about that. What Tito's paper also, the Minister of Finance's paper also makes very clear is about the need for pragmatism to start driving investment in the economy. I think those kinds of things are absolutely necessary, and I largely agree with him. He doesn't touch on, for instance, a wage freeze. I'm very, very supportive of a decision that says a wage freeze for CEOs, cabinet ministers and executives for at least 3 years, and with that, an inflation-linked increase for workers. Because if we don't do that, we're never going to be able to find the money to invest in the economy and in education and healthcare. Above inflation increases is just not on the cards. But you can't win that unless CEOs and executives are prepared to put something on the table. So I think something like that is necessary to win the political space.
Do you think there needs to be a more of a co-opting of the private sector? Because people always speak about the so-called investment strike by big business in South Africa. There is money there, there is capital there, but it's not being reinvested because of jitters around some of the issues that you've spoken about.
So absolutely. I think that there's money. I don't think this is an issue of money. I think that there is fundamental issues. Nobody trusts government. The private sector doesn't trust it. The citizens don't trust it. They think these guys are bloody thieves and they'll steal that money. So what you've got to do is win some confidence. You've got to win some confidence on policy certainty, and you've got to say to them that we will invest this in the appropriate ways. So this is why one of the things I said, if you want to win the mining sector, go for the once empowered, always empowered. But then negotiate the shift between 26 and 30%. But say to them, I'm going to invest that in equal allotments to early childhood development, university scholarships, the NHI, etc. You do that, then people will say, look, you're investing it in proper things, not so that a couple of political rogues get rich again.
So the concern raised about that once empowered, always empowered thing, both by legal commentators and even in that minority judgment in that case in the Gauteng High Court last year, is that the reason for the Mineral Resources and Petroleum Development Act and BE is to make sure the imbalances of the past are corrected. And once that once empowered, always empowered rule is there, that doesn't take place. And that's a concern. And that's been said that issue is not resolved yet. And it doesn't seem like it's going to be resolved for a while.
The problem is that you have to also consider the counter view. The counter view is everybody who gets empowered, then sells the shares, and the company that put an enormous amount of money, and by the way, the shareholders that put an enormous amount of money to pay for it, are back to square one 5 or 10 years later, because these guys pay out, and then the new lot of political elites want their share to start feeding off. Why not take a significant amount of that money and invest it in public institutions and public good? So instead of making individuals rich, say to them, we're going to we're going to empower students. We're going to use that money to empower and fix the health system. We're going to use that money to fix the early childhood development. Then there are systemic developmental outcomes. And importantly, it benefits the whole of society. Not 10 or 15 politicians associated with political parties.
So the concern raised by Siwenduje in that judgment is that if you do that, she's saying that that could result in a suspension or cancellation of mining rights if that once empowered a rule is followed. And that's got worse consequences for mining owners and people concerned.
What you saw is in the last 15 years, because of this policy uncertainty, because people who believe that they're going to invest, they never show. What we've lost out is a massive mining boom that should have happened between 2000 and 2010. The Australians, the Brazilians, every other sector actually succeeded in growing mining and using the resources generated from it to invest back in the economy. What we've done is, by enabling an uncertain climate, have compromised not only mining, but we've compromised a whole series of other areas. What I'm proposing is, yes, try and make a radical agenda. So I'm not opposed to the transformation, but make it broad-based. Broad-based is not a couple of guys, individuals making money and becoming billionaires. It should be to invest in the developmental enterprise.
Okay. Let's go to the issue of education now. You said that education should be an essential service, no strikes allowed. But Section 17 of the Bill of Rights protects that right, in particular to protest. And you've seen at Wits even how protesting led to a better quality of life for the workers at Wits who were insourced during that, after that fees must fall movement.
That's absolutely true. We would not have fundamentally shifted without some of that protest. But what we also saw is a massive amount of stability, and don't forget $1.5 billion worth of infrastructure burnt. Protest is allowed. Violent protest is not allowed. And there is a propensity in our society of protests becoming violent and strikes becoming violent. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, even with the Bill of Rights, there are sectors like the police and the defense force where they are declared essential services, and strikes are not allowed. And so it seems to me, in a climate, in a country where education is in crisis, where our children's future is at stake, when people are dying in hospitals, how can we not declare education and healthcare an essential service? Thirdly, I am not suggesting that we must ignore salaries in these cases and working conditions. I suggest for a national arbitration board of independent people who make decisions that are binding on executive management and the unions. So an impartial arbiter that will determine what is appropriate, how to deal with conflict in institutions, what is an appropriate wage, what is an appropriate conditions of service. What we've got to structure is an appropriate balance between the rights of individual workers, which I think is important, but also the future of this country, the future of our children, the fact that patients are dying in our public hospitals. You and I, if we get ill, we don't trust going to those public hospitals because they are shambles. The poor don't have that option. Let's think about them. Let's think about their future. And so I think all of us, the rich, the middle classes, the poor, all of us have to put something together, because only when we come together and set up a medium to long-term agenda do we have a future.
You've spoken on that issue of health, saying that the NHI should be done away with. It's a refrain that many people have spoken about, but government has said this is a way to make sure that people have access to quality healthcare despite their financial situation and their social status.
So I was very careful on what I said. I said the current NHI start off by negotiating the beginnings of universal healthcare and pricing arrangements. So I said, negotiate with the private sector to take on public sector patients, to make sure that they take on at a reasonable cost, and to police the pricing regulations, because actually our private healthcare is too expensive.
Why would the private healthcare sector do that?
At the moment, if you go for an all or nothing plan, you'll implode the entire system. We don't, let's be honest, which public hospital runs properly in this country? When Zweli Mkhize says, I promise you the private sector and the public sector hospitals will be equal. With due respect, go to any of our go to Barra. I go to Barra. Go to Charlotte Makeke and see the quality of the hospitals. And then go to private hospitals like Donald Gordon and Mill Park and see what the difference is. Who in their right minds believes that this is going to be of an equivalent quality? You'll implode it. Do it over a period of time. Start by regulating price. Start by forcing the private sector to take on public sector patients. We did it in Donald Gordon, which is a private hospital. We took public sector patients for liver transplants. We do it at a cost structure that is appropriate for the public sector. Let's start doing it slowly. Take it. You eat an elephant by small bites. You don't swallow the thing. The problem is South Africa does not have an execution capacity. Partly because everybody wants to do everything in one shot. They think because you learn to toy a little and have radical rhetoric, suddenly these things come up. I run an institution, Wits. Between 2013 and 2019, our graduates have gone up. Our PhDs have gone up. Our financial sustainability is there. Our research goes up. Our transformation numbers have gone up. You can transform with excellence. But when you're not pragmatic, when you're completely ideological, you destroy our institution. See what happened in Transnet. See what happened in Eskom. It's time that we started to learn the lessons of the failures of the first 25 years. That's what I'm calling for.
So you are calling for this. You've penned the series of tweets online and you're here tonight, but also you have perhaps more access to people in positions of power than an ordinary South African. What else, if anything, are you going to do to try and get your solutions, which you believe are correct, implemented? So,
to be honest, I wish I had more access than you think I have. I do have more access than ordinary people, partly because of my location as Vice-Chancellor of Wits. I will argue this with colleagues. Part of the reason why I do the Twitter stuff is to get it into the public discourse, to inform the public discourse, to engage and enrich the public discourse. But part of it will be also to articulate this in forums that we are at. Many of my colleagues at Wits sit in the Presidential Commission. I'll send this to them and I would hope that they would take it up if they agree with them. So, this is my view. It's not Wits's view. It's not a collective view. It's my view, and some of it perhaps are useful. Some of it may not be as useful. Some of it people won't agree with. I'm sure the private sector doesn't agree with a wage freeze of CEOs and executives. I'm sure that Zweli Mkhize as minister doesn't agree with some of my phrasing around the NHI, but I do think we need to start being pragmatic. And that's what I'm calling for. Pragmatism with radicalism.
Professor Adam Habib, thanks so much for your time on The Full View.